This country, with a population of over 200 million people, has always impressed with its contrasts and diversity. But now we will focus on the metropolis of Sao Paulo, the economic heart of the state. Among the numerous wealthy families of this city, the von Richthofen family stood out. Their estate, located in the prestigious Brooklyn district, was valued at around some 3 million Brazilian dollars. Imagine this: luxurious living rooms, cozy bedrooms, a huge swimming pool, a spacious office, and even a private library. All of this was hidden behind a high brick wall, surrounded by exotic plants. The entrance to the mansion was guarded by massive gates, as if emphasizing the status and privacy of the owners' lives. You know, when my colleagues told me about this family, I immediately understood that behind the external glamour and luxury, there could be something more. After all, as the saying goes, the wealthier the family, the more reasons for envy and ill intentions from others. And unfortunately, as subsequent events showed, this assumption turned out to be true. The house itself was surrounded by a high fence that securely protected the residents from prying eyes. However, the staff and guests had to pass through massive gates, which likely symbolized the strength and steadfastness of this family in the eyes of society. At least, that's how it might have seemed at first glance. Allow me to introduce you to the head of the von Richthofen family, Manfred, a brilliant German engineer. This man held the position of director in a large company responsible for the operation of highways and roads leading to Sao Paulo. His wife, Mauricia, was a native Brazilian and worked as a local psychiatrist. The story of their meeting is quite romantic. Manfred was studying civil engineering at the University of Sao Paulo at the time, and it was there that his eyes first met Mauricia's. As they themselves told, it was love at first sight. The friendly and sociable Mauricia perfectly complemented the calm and gentle Manfred. It seemed like fate had brought them together. Later, they got married and started dreaming of children. And so in 1983, their firstborn daughter, named Suzane, was born. 4 years later, her younger brother Andres was born. Both children grew up in a wealthy family and attended the most prestigious private schools in Sao Paulo. Describing Suzane, she was a rather quiet and shy girl. Although she was not a leader among her peers, she had a few close friends. Suzane was always an obedient daughter and had a warm relationship with her brother. Additionally, the girl showed remarkable abilities in languages and later mastered 3 foreign languages. After graduating from a German high school, she decided to continue her studies at the law faculty of the University of Sao Paulo. In my opinion, if Suzane had succeeded in the legal field, perhaps her life would have turned out differently. Despite her aspirations for a successful career, the girl never had a need for money. And there was a simple reason for this: her parents were extremely wealthy people. According to my information, the wealth of the von Richthofen family was estimated at approximately $17 million. And according to unverified information, Manfred had around 10 million euros in a Swiss bank account, which he planned to pass on to Suzane after her studies. So essentially, the girl only had to be an obedient daughter and wait for her inheritance. However, as the year 2002 approached, cracks began to appear in the relationship between the parents and Suzane. The girl had just reached adulthood and, as often happens, was more interested in love than finances. I will now share all the details with you. It seemed like the girl had everything: a carefree childhood, brilliant education, and a guaranteed $1 million inheritance. But did this bring her happiness? As subsequent events showed, probably not. By the year 2002, the relationship between Suzane and her parents began to deteriorate. The thing was, Suzane turned 18, and like most of her peers, she became more interested in love than finances. But let's go back a bit to 1999. At that time, the von Richthofen family visited an airplane model exhibition. Suzane's younger brother Andreas showed a keen interest in this hobby. It was there that he met 19-year-old Daniel Cravinhos, who already had experience in creating flying models. Intrigued, Andreas even asked his parents to pay for modeling lessons with Daniel, and they agreed, not suspecting the consequences it would lead to. While the boys enthusiastically engaged in building airplanes, Daniel unexpectedly caught the attention of Andreas' older sister, Suzane. At first glance, Daniel and Suzane seemed like complete opposites. He, a boy from a poor and troubled family, who was even expelled from college for poor performance. She, a well-bred girl from an aristocratic family who had received a brilliant education. However, despite all the differences, a real passion flared up between them. Suzane was intrigued by Daniel's rebellious nature. He was to her the embodiment of freedom and new exciting emotions. And although the girl understood that her parents would likely not approve of such a choice, she could not resist his charms. So Suzane began to secretly meet with Daniel. She did not yet know the tragic consequences this decision would lead to. For a while, this cunning plan worked. The parents were not thrilled about Daniel's visits, but still allowed him to come, considering him Andreas' regular friend. However, as it is known, lies eventually come to light, and one day, Montfort and Mauritia finally learned the truth about Daniel, that he was not studying anywhere, regularly used prohibited substances, and abused alcohol. Of course, such a discovery could not please them. As an experienced detective, I understand well the parents' desire to protect their child. Montfort and Mauritia spared no effort to ensure a better future for Suzane, and now all their efforts could go to waste because of some garage mechanic. But the lovers were not ready to give up. Unexpectedly, Suzane's younger brother Andreas stood by their side. The boy adored his sister sincerely and considered Daniel his best friend, so he decided to help the two of them by hiding their secret meetings from their parents. While Suzane and Daniel enjoyed their forbidden encounters, Andreas came up with plausible stories for the parents, covering for his sister. But how long would he be able to lead everyone by the nose? And what consequences would this deceit lead to? While Suzane and Daniel's romance was gaining momentum, Suzane's younger brother Andreas became their true guardian angel. He sincerely admired Daniel's rebellious spirit and adored his sister, so he actively facilitated their meetings. While the lovers were hanging out at the auto shop or spending time at Daniel's home, Andreas skillfully covered for them in front of their parents. The boy came up with ingenious excuses to justify Suzane's long absences and divert parental suspicions, but fate gave the couple a chance to be together for a whole month. Montfort and Mauritia set off on a long vacation to Europe, leaving the children in charge of the estate. Suzane, who had already turned 18 at that time, saw this as a great opportunity to prove her maturity and independence to her parents. However, Suzane decided differently. Instead of taking responsibility for the house, she secretly invited Daniel to stay at the mansion. And so the lovers spent a whole month enjoying life by the pool, generously pouring alcohol into their glasses and indulging in ecstasy like seeds. From a detective's perspective, I can assume that these two clearly decided to make up for lost time. After all, they had been forced to hide in corners and strangers' garages until now. And here they were, a luxurious empty house at their disposal. But as it is known, everything in life comes at a price. Upon their return from vacation, the parents learned how Suzane had spent her time in their absence, and thus real battles began in the von Richthofen family. The scandals and arguments did not cease for weeks. The parents tried to reason with their daughter, but she demonstratively ignored all their advice. Furthermore, Suzane became even more stubborn in her intention to be with Daniel. As the culmination of this confrontation, the girl presented her parents with a bold ultimatum. She demanded that Montfort buy her and her lover an apartment where they could live peacefully and happily. Of course, the family patriarch categorically refused. Montfort stated that Suzane could do whatever she pleased, but at her own expense. And for added emphasis, he threatened to cut off the defiant daughter from financial support. This decision infuriated the girl to the point of fainting. She ranted and stomped her feet uncontrollably, but eventually had to give in. At least she pretended to, because in reality, Suzane had no intention of giving up. She continued to secretly meet with Daniel. Moreover, the two of them began to hatch some sinister plan, a plan that later shocked all of Brazil and even made seasoned police officers shudder. Attention, I ask you to prepare yourself seriously, as what I am about to tell you is capable of shocking even the most resilient. So on November 1, 22, something horrifying happened at the von Richthofen family estate. Early in the morning, residents of the prestigious Brooklyn district woke up to desperate screams coming from the house. Some frantic screams of horror that sent chills down their spines. As later revealed, it was the children, Suzane and Andreas, screaming in despair when they saw a gruesome scene in their parents' bedroom. The previous evening, both teenagers had slipped out of the house for their own errands, and when they returned around 4 in the morning, they had no idea of the horror awaiting them inside. Upon entering the mansion, they ran upstairs to the main bedroom, hoping to greet their parents. But instead of Montfort and Mauritia's smiling faces, they were met with a gruesome sight. The bloody bodies of the couple lay on the bed in unnatural poses. It was clear at first glance they had been brutally murdered in their sleep. This was evidenced by the rumpled bed and scattered belongings. Judging from the chaos in the room, the unfortunate couple had woken up but had not even had a chance to resist. It seemed like the attackers burst in and immediately began to torment them. When the police officers arrived at the crime scene, they were faced with a horrifying sight. Montfort and Mauritia were beaten beyond recognition. Their faces turned into complete bloody masks, their bodies covered in numerous wounds, and prominent red marks of strangulation were visible on the victims' necks. What was particularly striking was that Morish's head was covered with a plastic garbage bag. Even hardened police officers had to shake themselves to start examining the bodies. Although it initially seemed like burglars had broken into the house, something didn't add up in this version. Yes, the criminals took cash from a suitcase and other hidden places. But was it necessary to be so cruel to the victims for the sake of money? Moreover, expensive items and electronics remained undamaged. Upon inspecting the office and living rooms, the cops came across a series of highly suspicious details. The first thing that caught their eye was the deactivated alarm system. Although the security guards were nearby, they were somehow not notified of the intrusion. Upon closer examination, it became clear. Someone entered the code and deliberately turned off the security system. Furthermore, the ransacked scene seemed somewhat peculiar. Documents and papers, although scattered around the office, were surprisingly evenly distributed. Not at all as it should be after a chaotic search by burglars. Everything indicated an attempt to stage a robbery. Another alarming detail, the doors and windows were left undamaged, meaning the criminals either had keys or someone let them in from the inside. And some rooms were completely bypassed by the criminals as if they knew there was nothing valuable there. While the police tried to unravel this tangle of mysterious circumstances, the public began to build the most incredible assumptions. The media, of course, immediately leaned towards the most obvious suspects, the children of the murdered couple, Suzane and Andreas. Reporters portrayed Andreas as a grief-stricken son barely holding it together, on the verge of losing his mind from the loss of his parents. The boy was so deeply affected by the tragedy that he would start gasping for breath from tears during interviews with journalists. In contrast, Suzane's behavior raised many questions in society. Unlike her brother, the girl remained remarkably restrained and aloof. There were no signs of despair or suffering, as if she was talking about distant relatives, not her own parents. Of course, everyone grieves in their own way, but Suzane's excessive calmness raised certain suspicions. During witness interviews, investigators learned interesting details about how the siblings spent the evening before the murder. It turns out that on October 31 at 9 p.m., Suzane took 15-year-old Andreas out of the house, supposedly to a party at an internet cafe. And all this without the knowledge of the parents, who thought their son had long been asleep in bed. Instead of staying with her brother, Suzane dropped him off at the entertainment venue and went off in an unknown direction herself. As later revealed, the girl booked a hotel room nearby to be alone. Why did she do this? Perhaps to secure an alibi for herself. These questions kept law enforcement officers on edge. But the most alarming detail was yet to come. Before checking into the hotel, Suzane called her boyfriend Daniel. She informed him that they could meet and hang out together. This raised reasonable suspicions with the lovers planning to have a party, but the strangeness did not end there. Around 4 in the morning, Suzane and Andreas secretly returned home and found their parents dead. So the children went for a walk, and when they returned, Montfort and Morisha had already been killed. Wasn't this too much of a coincidence? Moreover, the conflicting testimonies of Suzane and Andreas added more confusion to the case. While the boy claimed that the parents were strongly against his sister's relationship with Daniel, Suzane insisted that Montfort and Morisha had no issues with her choice of partner. And this, as we remember, was a blatant lie. So the first warning bells rang at this stage of the investigation. Suzane's strange behavior, both before and after the murder, cast suspicion on her and her boyfriend. However, the evidence gathered was insufficient to formally accuse them. On November 1, 2002, the von Richthofen couple was laid to rest. Relatives, colleagues of the deceased, and numerous media representatives gathered for the farewell ceremony. Journalists were intrigued by a peculiar detail. While Andreas cried uncontrollably, Suzane hardly shed a tear for her parents. Such indifference seemed suspicious even to the average person. Soon, shocking rumors began to spread throughout the town. It was rumored that just 3 days after her parents' death, heartless Suzane threw a loud poolside party at her estate. Allegedly, a crowd of young people gathered there, music blared throughout the neighborhood, and the hostess laughed carelessly, as if there was no sorrow. Of course, investigators could not rely solely on gossip. However, information about Suzane's strange behavior came from several independent sources. But what troubled detectives the most was an anonymous tip. A mysterious informant told the police about a suspicious purchase made by Daniel's brother Christian Cravinhos. The purchase of a Suzuki motorcycle itself did not seem unusual. However, Christian bought this vehicle at a local dealership just a few days after Montfort and Morisha's murder. At that time, Christian was 26 years old. He paid for the motorcycle in cash with large bills, which automatically raised suspicion. Those who knew the Cravinhos brothers closely unanimously claimed that neither Daniel nor Christian had a steady job or stable income. These guys were regulars at local bars and constantly used prohibited substances. So where did Christian suddenly get such a sum of money? This tip became a kind of final straw for law enforcement. Gathering all available information, the cops began to lean towards the idea that the solution should be sought among the victim's closest circle among family and acquaintances. And above all, they were interested in Suzane and Daniel, whose behavior raised the most questions. Of course, all these coincidences and strange facts could not yet be considered direct evidence. Something more substantial was needed to bring formal charges, so the police decided to focus all their efforts on digging into the young couple and their friends. And very soon, this approach yielded unexpected results. It was the information about the suspicious motorcycle purchase that became the key to unraveling this tangled case. Armed with this lead, the cops immediately summoned Christian Cravinhos, Daniel's brother, for questioning. This young man behaved extremely boldly. He pretended to be a tough guy who knew nothing about the murder. But when the investigators pressed him hard and presented the evidence, Christian finally cracked. What he revealed shocked even seasoned detectives. It turned out that the brutal murder of the von Rechthofen couple was orchestrated by none other than Daniel and Suzane. According to Christian, this couple planned the murder of the girl's parents, and all this was to finally live together and not depend on anyone. And perhaps the main motive was the $17 million that Suzane was supposed to inherit after Manfred and Maurice's death. Armed with this information, my colleagues immediately arrested the lovers and began interrogating them. And here is where the most interesting part began. Even with fresh handcuff marks on their wrists, Suzane and Daniel managed to accuse each other. The girl insisted that money was not the main motive for her. She claimed that she agreed to the murder under pressure from Daniel. But the boy immediately denied this version. According to him, the prospect of getting rich played a decisive role in Suzane agreeing to the crime. And most strangely, as soon as they found themselves behind bars, these two suddenly broke off their relationship. It was as if there were no intense feelings or shared dreams of a carefree life. Did the millions cloud their judgment and kill all humanity in them? But let's return to the court case. Despite undeniable evidence of guilt, an exception was made for Suzane. She was released on bail until the trial, which began almost 4 years after the crime. And during this time, she clearly did not mourn her parents. Using the services of top lawyers, Suzane almost took control of the entire inheritance. At the same time, she gave interviews to local media, where she cried in her vest and accused Daniel of all sins. She claimed that he ruined her family and life. On screen, Suzane appeared as a distraught and broken girl, a true victim of circumstances. But in my opinion, all this theatrics was just an attempt to whitewash her reputation. And honestly, she didn't succeed very well. Her tears sounded too fake, and her suffering seemed too staged. So when on July 17, 2006, the courtroom was filled, all the cards were laid out. The jury was presented with a detailed chronology of events on that fateful Halloween night. And what they heard took even the most resilient by surprise. It turns out that while Maurice and Manfred were peacefully asleep, unaware of the impending danger, Suzane cunningly led her younger brother out of the house. Andreas was convinced that his sister just wanted to take him to a party at an internet cafe. The poor boy had no idea of the true purpose behind Suzane's outing. After dropping her brother off at the party venue, Suzane returned home in a car with her accomplices Daniel and Christian. Although the security guard noticed her return, he had no idea that something terrible was about to happen. First, Suzane visited her parents' bedroom supposedly to check if Maurice and Manfred were sound asleep. Once she confirmed all was quiet, she deactivated the alarm system, allowing the nighttime guest to enter. Then the criminal trio calmly positioned themselves in the living room. They put on gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, pulled their hoods over their heads, and armed themselves with iron bars. Meanwhile, Suzane settled on the couch in front of the TV. Of course, how could she miss her favorite show, even during the murder of her parents? And then Daniel and Christian burst into the couple's bedroom and began assaulting them with the bars. Manfred and Maurice fought desperately for their lives, but the resistance proved futile against the two young, strong men. Seeking to end the bloody ordeal quickly, the brothers grabbed knives and finished off the unfortunate victims. While Manfred died immediately, Maurice turned out to be more resilient. She was still breathing, though it seemed like life was barely flickering in her battered body. Then Daniel committed an unprecedented act of cruelty. He placed a plastic bag over Maurice's head and tightened it with all his might, cutting off her air supply. Within minutes, the woman suffocated. After completing their dark deed, the three killers proceeded to stage a robbery to cover their tracks. They pocketed the money, scattered documents in the office, and left. Each went their separate ways to create alibis. Christian went to grab a bite at the nearest fast food joint. Daniel and Suzane pretended to be a couple in a hotel room and even requested a receipt as proof of their presence. But Suzane's behavior was the most cynical. Acting as if nothing had happened, she picked up her brother from the party, brought him home, and started wailing over the bodies of her slain parents. What an acting talent! During the trial, each tried to portray themselves as victims. Suzane blamed Daniel, mentioning some mysterious substances he allegedly constantly gave her to manipulate her. On the other hand, the Cravinhos brothers claimed they acted under the influence of the girl. They argued that she orchestrated everything, and they were just protecting their unfortunate friend from abusive alcoholic parents. However, the forensic examination quickly dispelled these myths. There was no trace of alcohol in the victim's blood. Gradually, a coherent picture began to form in the minds of the jurors, and it was grim news for the defendants. Prosecutor Roberta Treadley portrayed Suzane as the mastermind, the ideological inspiration behind the crime. In her speeches, the girl was depicted as a cunning enchantress driven by a thirst for money and power. According to the prosecution, Suzane was ready to go as far as stepping over her parents' bodies to finally achieve the freedom and wealth she desired. So on July 22, 2006, after 5 days of legal battles, the trio of killers was found guilty. Prosecutors pushed for a 50-year prison term, but unfortunately, such a severe punishment was not handed down to the criminals. Suzane and Daniel were sentenced to 40 years behind bars, while Christian received a lighter sentence of 38 years as an accomplice. However, Suzane has tried multiple times to appeal the court's decision. She claimed that mental disorders pushed her to commit the crime, or that she was not in her right mind. Of course, all these excuses were dismissed, but her charisma did work its magic. Currently, Suzane and Daniel are serving their sentences in a semi-open regime. This means they can go home for holidays and even take vacations, something usually not allowed for murderers. While Suzane serves her conditional sentence, the von Rechthofen family home was long sold to unknown buyers. Andreas was left without a roof over his head, without close relatives. And while his sister enjoys her semi-early release, he wanders the world like a ghost. And the worst part is that after Suzane's release, she will calmly inherit her parents' fortune. The same $17 million for which she committed murder. While her brother suffers in a shelter, the sister will once again lead a luxurious life. By the time her 40-year sentence ends in 2042, Suzane will walk free, rich, and unrestricted, and time will erase all traces of past crimes. Maria Alejandra Lafuente. She was one of those women who always attract attention. Attractive, athletic, well-groomed. As a child, boys probably craned their necks when she walked by. And even now, to be honest, it's hard to take your eyes off her. Maria Alejandra spent a lot of time in the gym, keeping her figure toned. She also loved sunbathing on the beach to maintain an even bronze skin tone. She clearly knew her worth and set a high bar in everything related to appearance. Blonde hair, pumped-up lips, deep-set eyes that wasn't her style. Maria Alejandra considered her appearance the standard of beauty and, admittedly, had every right to do so. But this woman was known not only for her beauty. In the professional sphere, she followed in the footsteps of her father, the renowned psychologist and psychiatrist Alberto Lafuente. It seems that Maria Alejandra simply adored her daddy and became passionate about the same sciences as him. After receiving the appropriate education, she opened her own psychology practice in Mexico City, not far from the city center. Her clients were mostly young people who faced problems such as depression, anxiety disorders, and deviant behavior. I'll be honest, I wouldn't mind visiting such an attractive specialist myself. But something tells me it's better not to mess with Miss Lafuente. Despite her profession, Maria Alejandra's personal life didn't work out. Her marriage to her husband fell apart, although they had 2 children together. But our heroine, it seems, was not afraid of the status of a single mother. She was not going to put up with the grey reality and threw all her energy into finding new love. And I must say, soon luck smiled upon her. She met the man of her dreams. However, as it turned out later, Maria Alejandra's methods of courtship were, to put it mildly, strange. In 2011, when she was already living with her new chosen one, something incredible happened. The woman committed a horrific crime against her ex-husband, and that's where things got really interesting. At first glance, Maria Alejandra seemed the embodiment of success. Intelligent, beautiful, influential. As is often the case, appearances are deceiving, and this woman caused a lot of trouble for which she paid with her life. According to an anonymous source, the man decided to visit his children and came to his ex-wife. She greeted him cordially and invited him into the living room, informing him that their daughter was preparing a surprise for her father and would appear shortly. Suspecting nothing, the man sat down on a plastic-covered sofa. The plastic on the couch looked suspicious, as if someone had prepared it on purpose. Maria Alejandra blindfolded him, supposedly so that he would not see his daughter's gift in advance. However, minutes passed and the daughter never appeared. Silence fell, and the man felt that something was wrong. The prolonged silence and absence of the daughter should have alarmed him and prompted him to remove the blindfold. Suddenly, he received a strong blow to the head with a poker. Taking off the blindfold, the man begged his ex-wife to calm down. However, Maria continued to strike. Trying to escape, he found that the doors were locked. At this stage, it became clear that there would be no surprise for the father, but a brutal reprisal was taking place. Convinced that the victim was at her mercy, Maria took a knife and stabbed the man in the stomach and back. Cornered, he tried to grab the knife, but Maria bit his hand. It's hard to believe that the ex-wife went this far over a divorce. After that, Maria tried to inject the man with some substance using a syringe, but he resisted until he miraculously managed to break free and escape. Their daughter, who had repeatedly witnessed her parents' quarrels, saw everything with her own eyes. It's not easy to imagine what this child had to go through, witnessing such brutal violence in her own home. Despite previous cases of domestic violence, this time the man decided to go to the police, believing that Maria had crossed all boundaries, and there was no point in doubting this thought. Why? I'll tell you now. The psychologist La Fuente was charged with attempted murder. The woman was imprisoned, and the criminal judge issued a decree on her official detention. Later, the crime was reclassified as attempted murder, mitigated by a completed act, and on June 14, 2012, the sentence was announced 1 year and 4 months in prison for Maria Alejandra. It seemed that justice was gradually taking effect, although the punishment seemed rather lenient for such a brutal crime. However, skilled lawyers made efforts to secure various benefits for their client. They managed to replace the actual imprisonment with a suspended sentence and fines. As compensation for material damage, Maria Alejandra paid her ex-husband $1,836. However, this looked like a symbolic amount compared to what she had to go through. The relentless lawyers even tried to prove that the woman acted in self-defense, since the ex-husband allegedly hit her first. An appeal was filed against the verdict. Eventually, the Judicial Criminal Chamber reconsidered its decision and completely removed criminal liability from Maria. Such an unexpected turn of events was probably a triumph for the lawyers, but seemed a cynical defeat for the justice system. Once free, Maria, as if nothing had happened, returned to her usual psychology practice. She managed to create an image of a victim of gender-based violence who fought for her independence. Undoubtedly, this made her even more attractive to potential clients. Soon Maria met Alan Carracula, a wealthy Mexican businessman. The 41-year-old tall man named Alan Carracula had an influential father, Adrian Carra Francis, the former director of the Judicial Police. Adrian had worked in law enforcement for a long time, where he had a successful career, holding high positions. In parallel with his civil service, he opened a number of food and construction companies, focusing mainly on the tile trade. Adrian founded a network of stores in southern Mexico. It seemed that everything was done legally, but in reality, Adrian had close criminal ties. Despite the legitimacy of the business, few knew about Adrian's connections to the mafia. When the truth was revealed, he was suspended and convicted of collaborating with a Mexican criminal organization involved in drug trafficking. Adrian was also accused of being involved with a gang from the border city near Juarez that controlled a significant percentage of drug trafficking from Mexico to the United States. This information about Adrian's criminal past was extremely important, as it undoubtedly influenced the formation of his son Alan. Given the proven facts of the former police chief's close ties to notorious criminals and his own confession, Adrian faced at least 20 years in prison. However, on July 18, 2000, he was released thanks to his participation in the Witness Protection Program. After his release, Adrian fully focused on business. His son Alan joined the business and headed the tile manufacturing enterprises. The prestigious position brought Alan considerable wealth and provided a lot of free time. I nearly choked on my donut when I heard what happened next. Alan Carracula was a married man and had a daughter. However, in 2011, his marriage fell apart and the couple divorced. The breakup hit Alan extremely hard. He fell into a deep depression, became emotionally devastated, and soon became addicted to alcohol. The breakdown of a family often becomes a real drama for all its members, leaving unhealed wounds. Trying to cope with depression and addiction, Alan began attending counseling sessions with a famous psychologist, Alberto, the father of Maria Alejandra. Alan's daughter also had a hard time dealing with her parents' divorce. Unable to cope with the grief alone, she sought help from a specialist. Alberto recommended his daughter Maria Alejandra as a psychotherapist. Perhaps this was the first fatal coincidence on the path to tragedy. After the third session, Maria expressed a desire to personally meet with the father of her client, explaining that it would help improve the quality of therapy. In reality, she planned to cunningly charm the lonely Alan and start an affair with him. Maria succeeded in this effortlessly. Manipulation was her main method of achieving what she wanted. Upon learning about her father's relationship with the psychologist, Alan's daughter became enraged and stopped coming to counseling. But Maria began to blackmail the girl, threatening suicide if she interfered with their relationship. A few weeks after they started dating, Maria managed to secure an official marriage proposal from Alan, who had not the slightest suspicion about the real reasons for her divorce from her ex-husband. And that's not all. In April 2014, Alan Caracula came to his parents for the weekend and told them about his fiancée. He announced that they would soon have a wedding and that his chosen one, Maria Alejandra, was probably pregnant. The very next Monday, the young couple officially registered their marriage, but there was not a single representative of the Cara family at the wedding ceremony. The immediate question arises, why did the groom's relatives ignore such an important event? As Alan's sister Margarita later said, the reason for their absence was the lie about a supposedly very modest wedding, which is why they were simply not invited. Instead, the bride's father, his wife and her children from her first marriage were present at the ceremony. The deliberate isolation of Alan from his own family during a marriage already looked suspicious and could indicate Maria's selfish motives. Shortly after the wedding, the idyllic relationship quickly fell apart. The relationship between the spouses Alan and Maria began to rapidly change for the worse. The reserved man said little about the details of his family life, but it was quite clear that there was no trace left of the former tender feelings. Such a striking transformation in attitude towards each other within a few weeks after the wedding clearly indicated the presence of hidden conflicts or psychological problems in the newly minted wife. Alan's close relatives noticed that his beloved had become more anxious, irritable, easily lost her temper, and fell into fits of anger for trivial reasons. Because of Maria's unpredictable behavior, they consciously tried to keep their distance from her and minimized any communication. According to Maria herself, one time she checked her husband's phone and allegedly found a number of compromising messages that indicated his infidelity. Suspicions of her husband's infidelity only added fuel to the fire of the existing tension between the newlyweds. This tension was now doomed to turn into something terrible. According to Maria Alejandra, the alleged evidence of infidelity was the last straw that broke the camel's back. She could no longer endure the cruel treatment from her husband and refused to put up with his infidelity. Convinced that the ruined marriage could no longer be saved, Maria rejected the idea of seeking help from psychotherapists or considering the legal path of divorce. It seemed that she had a radical idea to solve this problem once and for all. From now on, Maria had only one goal: to get rid of her husband by any means necessary. All her thoughts revolved around the cold-blooded planning of an exact, merciless, and perhaps fatal blow to Alan. Such an uncompromising, violence-prone mood of the woman clearly did not bode well for her victim. Meanwhile, Alan Cara himself had no idea about the real extent of the family conflict and the threat hanging over him. He continued to live a measured, everyday life, adhering to the usual routine, working, communicating with close relatives. Despite their frank dislike for Maria, Alan not only did not avoid contact, but even corresponded with his family daily in the WhatsApp messenger. Although they considered his marriage to Maria a somewhat hasty and reckless step, they still respected Alan's decision and continued to support him. However, the idyll quickly dissipated. Suddenly, the man's communication with relatives was abruptly cut off. October 31, 2014 was the last day Alan personally sent them an SMS. After that, he stopped showing up for work at his parents' house and stopped visiting his daughter from his first marriage. Alan no longer answered phone calls from relatives and did not record voice messages for them. However, from time to time, text messages continued to arrive in the messenger, allegedly from him, although they looked somewhat unusual and alarmed the recipients. Such a sudden, mysterious disappearance of Alan under strange circumstances clearly indicated some misfortune or disaster. Believe me, now it will be really interesting. I have not encountered anything like this anywhere. Maria Alejandra carried out her criminal plan in cold blood and with mathematical precision. She waited patiently for Alan to return home from work and offered him a glass of a drink into which she had previously mixed a powerful psychotropic drug used to treat depression and other mental disorders. This remedy had a pronounced sedative, calming effect, and in case of an overdose, it could cause complete loss of sensitivity and paralyze movements. And that's exactly what happened to Alan. The use of psychotropic substances to neutralize the victim indicates cold-bloodedness and, undoubtedly, a criminogenic state of mind of Maria. When Maria was sure that her husband was completely immobilized, she mercilessly stabbed him in the stomach with a knife and watched him die, showing no emotion. Her next task was to get rid of the corpse as quickly as possible. To do this, she dragged his lifeless body into the bedroom, laid it on the floor, and using an ordinary household electric saw, cut her heavy victim into pieces that could be lifted and hidden in plastic garbage bags. The cold-bloodedness and lack of remorse with which this woman took the life and dismembered the body of her husband is shocking and striking. Maria placed the torso in one large bag and the severed arms and legs without extremities in another bag. To facilitate the transportation of the remains, she packed both bags in a red suitcase. Body parts that could help identify Alan, such as the head, feet, and hands, the killer placed in a separate bag and hid it in the freezer in the kitchen. After such actions, there could be no doubt about her criminal intentions. Maria did everything possible to conceal the murder. Around 12:45 at night, when Maria Alejandra finished the preparations, she called the security of the private residential complex where they lived. She asked the guards to help load the red suitcase into a van. This was recorded in the observation log. The security staff noticed that Maria behaved very nervously and looked around significantly. Her behavior clearly revealed anxiety and worry about the crime she had just committed. After the suitcase was loaded, Maria drove off in her car. She only returned after 4 a.m. and did not leave the house again. All her actions seemed extremely suspicious. It later turned out that Maria had scattered the bags with her husband's remains at 2 different points in the city. Upon returning home, she changed the locks on the doors and informed the guard that she and Alan were going on a trip. For several days, nothing was heard about them. Maria acted extremely deliberately, trying to conceal the crime and deflect suspicion from herself. On November 6, 2014, the Capital's police found a human torso without limbs on a street corner in one of the city's districts. Later that day, representatives of the Ministry of Public Security reported the discovery of the rest of the human remains, including arms and legs without hands and feet, which lay in black plastic bags. The rather significant distance between the 2 places where the bags were dumped explained why Maria took so long to return that early night. The cold-bloodedness with which she committed these actions is striking. The remains were taken to the Institute of Forensic Expertise, where anthropologists confirmed that they belonged to one person. However, at that time it was not possible to establish the identity of the deceased. To divert the attention of Alan's relatives and prevent them from going to the police, Maria used his phone and began answering messages on his behalf. Maria Alejandra, resorting to insidious manipulations, temporarily concealed the tragic fate of Alan. This gave her the opportunity to gain precious time to develop a plan that would allow her to avoid punishment, as had already happened before when she attacked her first husband. Alan's relatives' brothers, sisters, and daughter received messages from him on WhatsApp, where he allegedly regretted getting married and complained about life's troubles. But at the same time, it mentioned a new charming woman he was dating. Other messages contained contradictory information. In some, Alan was supposedly enjoying solitude, while in others he was traveling. Meanwhile, Maria Alejandra's father, Alberto, began calling Alan's parents, asking about the whereabouts of his daughter, who had not been in touch for several days. Later, Alberto called again and said that he had found Maria Alejandra at the National Institute of Psychiatry, where she was being treated for depression caused by Alan's alleged infidelity. He also noted that his daughter was panically afraid of being pursued by the police, which became an additional reason for hospitalization. This convoluted lie lasted for months until December. During the pre-New Year period, when relatives usually gather together, Alan's family and loved ones decided to visit him. But Maria Alejandra was one step ahead, informing them that she and her husband would not be at home as they had decided to take a spontaneous vacation. This alarmed Alan's relatives because Alberto had recently said that his daughter was in a psychiatric hospital. It was then that they went to the police and filed a missing person report for Alan. It took the authorities several days to make the necessary inquiries and analyze the situation. Prosecutors interacted with employees of the Center for Missing Persons, which significantly advanced the investigation. Experts compared the characteristics of the found human remains with the features of various missing persons. Eventually, it became clear that the dismembered body belonged to Alan, who was later identified by relatives. Thanks to the persistent work of investigators and experts, the truth finally came to light. After the decision to inspect the couple's home, the police met Maria Alejandra at the scene. She was taken to the police station, where a search warrant was issued. As soon as all the formalities were settled, law enforcement officers thoroughly examined the house in search of evidence. In the freezer, they found Alan's head, feet, and hands, as well as an electric saw. When examining the rooms, experts used luminol, which helped them find traces of blood in one of the rooms and the bathroom. They noticed a hole cut in the mattress and a missing piece of carpet. Obviously, this was done to hide traces of fluids. It was established that it was on these items that parts of Alan's body were lying. At first, Maria Alejandra testified as a witness, but when the contradictions became too obvious, she was reclassified as a suspect. Soon, the investigation found out that it was she who sent messages from her husband's phone so that his family would believe that he was alive and not report his disappearance. The woman insisted that she knew nothing about Alan, had not seen him for several days, and had not even spoken to him on the phone. Using her position as a psychologist and trying to prove her innocence, she showed a registration card from a psychiatric clinic dated to the days that coincided with the date of Alan's alleged death. The criminal denied any involvement in the murder, but Alan's body spoke for itself. Forensic experts were able to fully reconstruct the chronology of events. Analyzers and studies recorded in the autopsy report showed a wound on the torso from a sharp object that penetrated the abdominal cavity. The injury proved fatal. Then the body was disfigured with something sharp with serrated edges. After the relevant study, it became known that Alan died between the last hours of November 5, 2014 and the early morning of the next day. The collected evidence allowed investigators to establish a direct connection between Maria Alejandra and the brutal murder of her husband. They also managed to find out her whereabouts on that fatal day. The building's observation log helped, which recorded the specific time the woman went outside and her return. Added to this was the case with the heavy suitcase that she was helped to load into the car. From the statements of Alan's daughter and his sister, it turned out that the psychologist threatened the girl with suicide if she objected to the relationship with her father. Although the woman tried to pretend that she was undergoing treatment in a clinic for the mentally ill in order to avoid responsibility, experts refuted the presence of mental illness in her. Cornered by irrefutable evidence, Maria Alejandra had to admit to attacking her husband. But she immediately justified herself, saying she was tired of his attitude. On December 10, 2014, Judge Carlos Ortiz Camacho, acting as head of the criminal court, issued a decree on the woman's official arrest on charges of murder with an aggravating circumstance kinship. After being detained, the suspect was taken to the 69th Court of the Women's Social Rehabilitation Center in Mexico City. Later, new information emerged that probably pointed to Maria Alejandra's involvement in other violent crimes with fatal consequences. It was recalled that in 2012, police found a bucket with a human head and hand near the entrance to the La Fuente family's house. The man whom the criminal deprived of life, another who narrowly escaped death at her hands, and another unknown victim, possibly killed by Maria Alejandra in 2012, all this suggested that the crimes were committed with the help of the defendant's father, who most likely was an accomplice in concealing her actions and distracting public attention. In Alan's case, there is a version that Alberto Lafuente was involved not only in the concealment, but also in planning the attack. It is believed that the motive was purely economic because, according to an investigation by local media, for many years the policeman's son contributed to the deprivation of Alberto's property. Thus, a suspicion arose that the father and daughter were dangerous criminals and acted in tandem. However, justice could not fully prove this fact. After 8 years of waiting, on September 5, 2022, the Attorney General's Office of the Capital finally announced the final verdict. For premeditated murder with an aggravating circumstance kinship, Maria Alejandra Lafuente was sentenced to death by hanging. This is an unprecedented punishment in modern Mexican justice. After the decision was made, the convict has no right to review it or to any alternative or mitigating measures instead of imprisonment. She was also obliged to compensate for the damage caused and the funeral expenses. In addition, she lost her political rights. Maria Alejandra was a prudent woman who apparently used her father's influence and protection to commit cold-blooded crimes against men close to her. Having not received proper punishment for the attack on her first husband, she emerged from the situation as an aggrieved lady, which further revealed her ability to manipulate. And just 3 years later, the woman repeated her actions, taking the life of her second husband. With striking composure, she planned the last crime and even pretended to be feeble-minded in order to avoid responsibility again. But this time she went too far. Nothing could save her from the harsh and just verdict of Themis. Abigail White was a true internet star with an army of devoted fans. For several years, the girl had been successfully earning money on a popular site by sharing her revealing photos. Despite Abby openly talking about her happy relationship with her boyfriend, a horrifying reality was hiding behind the perfect image, which eventually came to the surface. This stunning story took place in 2022 in the city of Bristol in the southwest of Great Britain. Bristol is a large port city with a population of over 400,000. Interestingly, it's the only city in the country where the well-being of residents is on average higher than in all of Britain. It would seem to be an ideal place for a carefree and happy life. But even in such prosperous regions, horrible events sometimes occur that shock the entire community. It was here in Bristol that Bradley Lewis was born in March 2000. The boy grew up in a friendly and loving family. His parents, Steve and Rachel Lewis, were wonderful people for whom family always came first. Bradley had been a good-natured and cheerful boy since childhood. Like many of his peers in England, he was passionate about soccer from a young age and dreamed of becoming a professional player. While studying at St. Stephen's School, Bradley actively played for the local soccer team. He had many friends and buddies. As a teenager, he started going to parties, where at the age of 14 he met 15-year-old Abigail White. At the time, it seemed like a typical teenage infatuation that would pass with time, as with most peers. But who could have imagined what tragedy these seemingly innocent relationships would lead to? Bradley and Abby seemed like the perfect couple, young, beautiful, in love. But despite the outward idol, their personalities and life experiences were strikingly different. While Bradley grew up in a loving family and was surrounded by care and understanding from childhood, Abby had been through real hell and carried the burden of psychological trauma. The girl's family life began to fall apart when she was only 2 years old. Her parents constantly quarreled and even got into fights in front of their little daughter. When Abby turned 4, they finally divorced, and her mother took the girl to live with her. But not for long, soon a stepfather appeared in their life who turned out to be a real domestic tyrant. The mother's new husband not only abused his wife, but also raised his hand against little Abby. To somehow protect her daughter from this nightmare, the woman made the difficult decision to send her to live with her grandparents. So at the age of 4, the girl lost not only her father, but also her mother, finding herself being raised by elderly relatives. Of course, such traumas could not but affect Abby's behavior. At school, she constantly got into trouble, quarreled with teachers and classmates. Studying was difficult for her grades were low, and the threat of expulsion was very real. When the girl turned 13, at the insistence of the school administration, she was sent for a consultation with a psychiatrist. The specialist found a whole complex of psycho-emotional disorders in the young patient that required serious correction. As a detective with experience, I have often encountered similar cases. Unfortunately, children who have experienced domestic violence or separation from their parents often grow up troubled and unstable. They need a special approach, understanding, and patience from adults. But unfortunately, not everyone receives proper help and support in such a situation. Apparently, Abby also did not have enough resources to cope with her demons. Despite all the difficulties, she tried to stay afloat and not give up. Perhaps that is why she so desperately clung to Bradley, a guy who promised her love, care, and security. But will this young couple in love be able to build a strong relationship despite all the trials of fate? You will find out the answers very soon, but I really want it to be those of you who right now subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write any comment to it so that this material can be seen by as many people as possible. This is very important for the social consciousness of society. Despite all the efforts of doctors and the prescription of antidepressants, Abby's life did not undergo cardinal changes. But at the age of 15, she met Bradley Lewis, and it seemed that a ray of light had finally appeared in her fate. The young man graduated from school, obtained a flooring specialist qualification, and started working, building his own future. Abby, on the other hand, chose a different path. Instead of looking for a permanent job or getting an education, she discovered the OnlyFans site for herself, a platform where authors can share content with their subscribers for a separate fee. And although this service can be used for various purposes, it is most famous thanks to models who attract fans with revealing photos. It was this kind of content that Abby began to create. Under the pseudonym Mitzi Lewis, the girl actively published her spicy photos, calling herself a fake Barbie. Her popularity grew rapidly, and with it, her income. In just 1 year, Abby managed to earn an impressive £50,000 sterling, over $60,000. It seemed she had finally found her niche and could count on a cloudless future. But was this success real? Could a girl who had suffered from psychological trauma and lack of love all her life find happiness in this way? And how did Bradley, who was used to completely different values, react to her choice? All these questions haunted those who knew Abby and her story. As a person who has repeatedly faced similar situations, I can say that quick money rarely brings true satisfaction, especially if it is obtained at the cost of one's own dignity and self-respect. Very often, behind outward success lies an inner emptiness and pain that cannot be filled with likes and subscriptions. Perhaps this is what Abby felt, despite her popularity on OnlyFans. Maybe deep down she understood that she had chosen the wrong path, but did not have the strength and courage to get off it. Or maybe she just didn't see any other way out, because she was used to the fact that life is a continuous struggle for survival. Be that as it may, the story of Abby and Bradley is still far from over. Whatever happens next, one thing can be said for sure. The path Abby has chosen does not lead to true happiness and harmony, and only by realizing this can she change something in her life. And just in case, I don't condemn OnlyFans so that you don't think anything for yourself there. I just think that in this case, it's inappropriate, in my opinion. And what do you think about this platform? Share your thoughts in the comments. It seemed that Abby had finally found her calling and could count on a carefree future. But already at the beginning of the second year of her career on OnlyFans, the situation changed dramatically. New models who registered on the site every day provided serious competition for the fake Barbie. Abby's popularity was rapidly melting away, and with it, her income. If in the first year the girl earned an impressive £50,000, in the second year it was only $12,000. Abby found herself facing the threat of a financial crisis. Meanwhile, the girl's family life was becoming increasingly difficult. At the time of the decline in her popularity on OnlyFans, Abby and Bradley already had 4 children. Although the details about their gender and age were kept secret, it is known that Abby gave birth to 1 child from another man. The young family huddled in a small house, and Bradley had to work a lot to provide his loved ones with a decent existence. Fortunately, Bradley's parents always supported the young couple and took an active part in raising their grandchildren. This was a real joy for Abby, who often posted happy family photos on social networks. But behind these idyllic pictures hid a completely different reality full of conflicts, resentments, and misunderstandings. Abby and Bradley's relationship had never been easy or cloudless. Over time, the girl began to have problems with alcohol and drugs. She often came home in a state of heavy intoxication, which could not but affect the atmosphere in the family. Abby herself vehemently denied having a serious addiction, blaming everything on fatigue and stress. As a psychologist, I often encounter similar cases. Unfortunately, people who have experienced psychological trauma in childhood often seek solace in alcohol or drug. It gives them the illusion of control over their own lives and helps them escape from painful memories. But in reality, such behavior only worsens the situation, destroying not only health, but also relationships with loved ones. It seems that this is exactly what happened to Abby. Instead of seeking professional help and working on herself, she chose the easiest path, self-destruction. And Bradley, who was used to traditional family values, simply did not know how to react to such behavior from his beloved. He either tried to support her or broke into shouting and accusations, which only deepened the gap between them. Gradually, their marriage turned into a battlefield, where everyone strove to prove their rightness and defeat the other. And the children suffered the most from this, growing up in an atmosphere of constant conflict and tension. And although outwardly Abby and Bradley's family looked quite prosperous, in fact it was cracking at the seams, threatening to fall to pieces at any moment. Abby masterfully played the role of the victim, complaining to everyone around her about her boyfriend Bradley. Supposedly, he was horribly controlling her, cheating left and right, and she couldn't live because of his cruelty. And although close people knew the true value of these accusations, the girl did not stop, painting herself as an unhappy martyr in the paws of a despot. But if only Abby had looked in the mirror, she would have seen there the real tormentor of this relationship. Because in reality, it was she who was having an affair on the side, not shunning any means to fulfill her whims. Moreover, she even managed to get pregnant by her lover and give birth to a child, whom she forced Bradley to recognize as his own. Lies, it seems, were as necessary for Abby as air. Meanwhile, Bradley's friends were sounding the alarm, begging him to run away from this madwoman before it was too late. "Dude, she's a complete psychopath. You're like a thing to her that she can twist however she wants," they whispered in fright. But the boy, madly in love, stubbornly refused to hear anything, hoping by the power of his love to turn Abby into an angel. But can you cure someone who has no intention of recovering? This is the question that haunted Bradley's mother, who could barely hold back her tears as she watched her son suffer. Every humiliating remark from Abby, every contemptuous look of hers struck right into the woman's heart. And somewhere deep down, she understood that this story could not end well. And she looked into the water, as they say. In the end, the quarrels and noise in the young family reached such proportions that social services had to intervene. From now on, Abby was forbidden not only to live with Bradley, but even to approach him. The boy had to pack his bags and move back in with his parents. But did this mean the end of their relationship? Or maybe just the beginning of a new act in this drama? As a seasoned detective, I have foreseen many similar stories, and I will say frankly, they rarely end with a happy ending. Such toxic bonds cling too tightly, the poison of manipulation and violence penetrates too deeply. And to break out of this vicious circle, you need extraordinary strength and determination. It would seem that the ban on seeing each other should have put an end to the toxic relationship between Abby and Bradley. But no way. The crazy girl simply could not leave the boy alone. Every day she literally terrorized him with calls, demanding that he return home for at least one night. And Bradley, as if hypnotized, time after time succumbed to these persuasions, neglecting basic safety measures. Meanwhile, Abby discovered a new way of self-affirmation for herself: social networks. With relish playing the role of a wronged single mother, she shot TikToks where she poured a ton of dirt on Bradley. And although virtual does not always correspond to reality, trusting viewers willingly swallowed this simple sentimental bait. In her tirades, Bradley turned into a real monster, soulless and a pathological liar. You can only get the truth out of him by interrogating him all night. Abby complained tearfully in one of her voice messages to a friend. And then a real bombshell. "He says I need a psychologist. Like otherwise, one of us will definitely end up dying. And you know what? I believe I'm capable of killing, even if later I have to rot behind bars." And probably to prove the seriousness of her intentions, on March 19, 2022, Abby decided to prove it. During another furious quarrel, the girl grabbed a knife and thrust it straight into Bradley's hand with a knife. The wound turned out to be no joke. The boy had to urgently rush to the hospital in order not to bleed to death. As a detective with considerable experience, I will say frankly, they do not joke with such statements. If a person has once crossed the line and allowed themselves to resort to violence, they will do it again. The only question is when the next outburst of aggression will happen and how serious its consequences will be. Unfortunately, Bradley was in no mood for abstract reasoning. Having patched up the wound, he continued to reach out to Abby, like a moth to a flame. The boy simply could not believe that his beloved was capable of real atrocities. He forgave her all her madness time after time, hoping that a miracle would happen now and the girl would come to her senses. But the miracle did not come. Instead, the relationship between Abby and Bradley increasingly resembled a fierce game of cat and mouse. They either quarreled until they were hoarse or fell into each other's arms, as if trying to make up for lost time. And above their heads, like the sword of Damocles, hung the ominous shadow of the knife that so mercilessly plunged into Bradley's body. Bradley decided to cover for Abby when the doctor inquired about the origin of the wound on his arm. "I just bumped into something at work," the boy lied, not wanting his crazy girlfriend to get into trouble with the police. But after this incident, even he, hopelessly in love, realized it's time to run away from this madwoman, no matter what joint children they have. But no way. As if enchanted, Bradley reached out to Abby again and again, ignoring all the warnings of social services. And here, just 6 days after the knife incident, Thursday, March 25, 8 p.m., a chilling scream comes from the house where the White Lewis family lived. Abby, sobbing, begs for help, demands to urgently call an ambulance. The neighbor is the first to rush to the alarm, thinking that someone has fallen ill. But when the frightened Abby mutters something about her Bradley no longer breathing, the woman rushes to the White Lewis house to see with her own eyes what is happening there. And the picture that opens up is enough to make one faint on the spot. Everywhere you look in the corridor, in the living room, dark, ominous blood stains. But the real horror awaited in the kitchen. Right in the middle of the room on the floor, Bradley lay on his back, pale, motionless, clearly unconscious. And on the windowsill, a bloody knife stuck out carelessly, a silent witness to some terrible drama. The dumbfounded neighbor, numb with fright, dials 911 with trembling hands. A moment later, her husband bursts into the kitchen and freezes, struck by what he saw. What happened in this house? Why is Bradley lying motionless in a pool of his own blood? And most importantly, whose hands so mercilessly plunged a knife into him? All these questions swarmed in my head as the sirens of the ambulance and cops wailed, and something suggested that the answers to them would turn the life of not only the White Lewis family upside down, but also of everyone who even caught a glimpse of the abyss of their toxic relationship. Abby, trembling like an aspen leaf, was muttering something about some accident, begging me to believe that she had nothing to do with it. But how could one believe the word of a girl who was used to lying right and left? A girl who just a week ago admitted that she was capable of murder? The answer is obvious. Of course not. As an experienced detective, I know perfectly well. People with a dark past rarely change. And if they have once crossed the line of what is permitted, then they will almost certainly do it again. Simply because they are used to living by the laws of the jungle, where the strongest and most brutal survives. It seems that it was this primordial thirst for blood that pushed Abby to the fatal act. Unable to withstand another quarrel or simply going crazy with jealousy, she grabbed a knife and stabbed her beloved in the back, literally and figuratively. Or maybe it was all completely different. Maybe Bradley, driven to despair by constant reproaches and humiliating treatment, dared to fight. That fateful evening, Abby once again gave free rein to her demons. At the bar, she kept knocking back shot after shot, completely losing control of herself. Drunk and furious like a witch from a fairy tale, the girl swore at the staff and visitors, not mincing words. It seemed that she had completely forgotten about decency and common sense. Meanwhile, Bradley and his friend Ryan slipped into the bathroom, where the boy, unable to restrain his emotions, burst into tears. Through sobs, he confessed that he dreamed of running away from Abby as far as he could see, but he was afraid because his psycho girlfriend had threatened to take her own life if he left her. What a trap, my friends. Neither to run nor to stay. While the boys were sharing revelations in the men's room, Abby managed to get into trouble. Having been rude to one of the visitors, she earned a slap in the face and even fell to the floor. It's good that her friend picked her up and led her aside, otherwise they would have had to gather the beauty in pieces. When Bradley and Ryan returned to the table, an unpleasant surprise awaited them. Abby, without thinking twice, threw a glass of cocktail in her beloved's face and began to scream that he did not stand up for her honor. And when Ryan tried to calm his friend down, she spat right between his eyes. That's some lady, I tell you. At 7:30, the couple was already rumbling home in the car of their old friend Alfie, whom they had met at the bar. The guy said that all the way Bradley and Abby were gnawing at each other like rabid dogs, and as soon as they drove up to the house, the girl jumped out of the car and rushed inside, as if all the demons of hell were chasing her. Bradley sat with his friend for a few more minutes, as if anticipating something. As a farewell, he uttered an ominous phrase, "I will die when I return home." Alfie shuddered at these words. They sounded too creepy. Just in case, he left Bradley his number so that he could call if anything. Having said goodbye to his comrade, the guy went to meet his fate, and she was already waiting for him on the threshold, wicked as 100 devils and with a knife in her trembling hands. During a quarrel, Abby did stick the blade into her beloved's chest, and in just 20 minutes, the neighbor was already calling 911. A finale worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy. When the detectives began to study Bradley's cell phone, an unpleasant discovery awaited them. It turns out that over the past months, Abby had been bombarding the guy with hundreds of messages with threats, and so terrible that I'd better keep silent so as not to disturb your imagination. Before the trial, Abby was examined by a whole bunch of psychologists. Their verdict was disappointing. The girl has a borderline personality disorder, because of which she is not able to control her emotions and outbursts of anger. In addition, a few days before the massacre, Abby experienced a double stress, an abortion and the news of Bradley's new passion. No wonder she lost her mind. But at the time of the commission of the crime, she was in a completely healthy state. But despite all the diagnoses, the jury was relentless. After deliberating for 12 hours, they unanimously found Abby Gale White guilty of premeditated murder. The sentence is life imprisonment with a right to parole in 18 years. That is, this Missy will be released no earlier than 2040, when she turns 41. What a perspective. And while the killer is in prison, Bradley's family is picking up the pieces of their lives. The father admitted that the loss of his son was the most terrible tragedy for him, and the mother still carries this pain in her heart. But at least they can count on the support of the community. Hundreds of caring people came to Bradley's funeral. The soccer club where the boy kicked the ball even held a charity match and transferred part of the proceeds to the Lewis family. And the former coach, with tears in his eyes, recalled Bradley as a bright and sincere child, the true pride of his parents. As for Abby, she lost everything: her beloved children, freedom, future. And this is probably the most terrible punishment for a woman who with her own hands destroyed what others would give their lives for. But will she understand her guilt? Will she atone for her sins? Who knows? One thing is certain: this bloody story will still fester hearts for a long time, reminding us of the price of jealousy and unrestrained passions. So be careful, my friends. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and may you never have to find yourself on the other side of the protective glass, either in the courtroom or in a prison cell. Because life is the most precious gift, and to exchange it for some emotions or grudges is a crime that has no justification. With this, our eerie tale comes to an end. Thank you for being with me all this time and living every moment of this drama. I hope it made you think and maybe take a fresh look at some things.